Good morning, friends. This morning I want to take you to the book of Acts and a few of the writings of the Apostle Paul to give you something of a case study in peacemaking. Now, in full disclosure, we don't have an awful lot of details, so perhaps the case study has but one point, which is in the church, even when sharp disagreements happen, even if people go their separate ways, reconciliation is possible. When it comes to peacemakers, there is no situation that is a lost cause. It might take a long time, years perhaps, but reconciliation is always a possibility as the Lord wills. So, I take you to Acts chapter 13, verse 13. In this section, Luke is describing Paul's travels on his first missionary journey throughout the northeastern area of the Mediterranean Sea. And we read, "Now Paul and his companions set sail for Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia. And John left them and returned to Jerusalem, but they went on from Perga and came to Antioch in Pisidia." So this just seems like a standard account of their travels, and we know that one of Paul's companions, a man named John, leaves and goes back to Jerusalem. We'll find out in a moment that this is a man who is also named Mark, and so sometimes called John Mark. That also means that this is the man who ended up writing the Gospel of Mark. So we're talking about a gospel writer here. He's not just some, somebody in the background who's insignificant. This is a writer of Scripture that we're talking about. So just keep that in mind as we continue. Anyway, Paul and the rest of his crew continue on while John Mark returns to Jerusalem, though for the moment we're not told why he leaves them. Then we go to Acts chapter 15, verses 36 to 41, after Paul and the rest had also returned to Jerusalem for a while. But now Paul is considering another missionary journey, a second missionary journey. And we read, "And after some days Paul said to Barnabas, 'Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are.' Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work." So we'll stop here for a minute, because this sheds light on what happened in Acts 13:13. Clearly, Paul feels like in leaving to go back to Jerusalem, John Mark had abandoned the work of the ministry. And we're not told why. Perhaps he was afraid. Some speculate he was homesick. But whatever the reason, when it comes right down to it, we don't know why he left, but we do know that Paul felt betrayed by his departure. And now Barnabas wants to have John Mark rejoin them for their second missionary journey, and Paul is having none of it. Continuing in verse 39, we read, "And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark, John Mark, with him, and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches." So Paul and Barnabas disagreed so vehemently over whether John Mark should go with them, they split up. Barnabas took John Mark, and they went on their own journey, and Paul took a man named Silas and went on his own journey. Now remember, Paul is an apostle. And Barnabas is also a very noted man in the church. It was actually Barnabas that vouched for Paul and introduced him to the church when the church was still afraid that Paul's conversion was a ruse so that he could work his way into the church and then persecute them from within. So Paul and Barnabas have a tight history with each other. But now it appears their relationship is on the rocks. They've disagreed and have gone their separate ways. Now, that's all the detail that the book of Acts gives us on the matter. But it's important that we're told these things. Number one, because in writing his scriptures, God does not cover up the flaws of his people. Even apostles and other prominent church leaders struggle with sin, struggle with anger, struggle perhaps with pride and ego and so on. And God allows us to see that. Not so that we can excuse our own sin by saying, well, if Paul struggled with anger, then it's okay if I struggle with anger. No, that's not the point at all. The point is that we all need God's grace and mercy. Apostles, church leaders, elders, deacons, whoever. We all need to go to our high priest with confidence to receive mercy and grace in our times of need. And it's also important to know this story of Paul and Barnabas' disagreement over John Mark, because it makes a few other seemingly insignificant statements of Paul's incredibly powerful. Because the disagreement was caused by an event during the first missionary journey, and the disagreement itself happened just prior to the start of Paul's second missionary journey, which means all of his letters to the various churches were written after this disagreement. So when we come to 1 Corinthians 9:6, this is taking place well after the events we just talked about. And in this passage, Paul is talking about how people view him, and it seems like he's addressing the idea that people view the other apostles, like Peter, the 12 quote-unquote main apostles. They view those apostles one way, but him a different way. And so he writes, "Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living?" The theological issue here is that Paul is reinforcing the idea that those who preach the gospel full time, according to God's calling, have a right to make their living preaching the gospel. And for our purposes, we know that he speaks of Barnabas as a fellow worker. He actually puts Barnabas and himself in a class together, comrades in arms, as it were, who were being mistreated. And this shows that these two men have come together and reconciled. No hard feelings. They are brothers. Paul sees them as co-workers for Christ, and he's willing to once again be tightly connected to his brother Barnabas. And not only that, but in 2 Timothy 4:11, Paul is writing from a prison in Rome. He is awaiting his own execution, and among his concluding statements, he writes, "Luke alone is with me. Get Mark," meaning John Mark, "and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry." So here we see that Paul wants John Mark to be with him now. They too have reconciled, and Paul has seen John Mark's faithfulness to the Lord and his usefulness for ministry. And while we aren't told any more than this concerning Paul's thoughts on Barnabas or John Mark, it's clear that the sharp dispute of Acts 15 was not the end of the story. There was reconciliation. And it might have taken place years later or over the course of years, perhaps. We don't know, but clearly it happened. So friends, take hope in that. Because is there someone in your life that you know you need to make peace with? You need to be reconciled. As Paul said elsewhere, again, as much as depends on you, live in peace with everyone. Perhaps they simply won't be willing to submit to reconciliation. But if that's the case, that's not on you. What is on you is to strive for peace as much as depends on you. And so there may be a rift between you and someone else that's grown oh so wide over the years, but know this: God is the God of life. He is the God of peace. He is able to reconcile, and he gives to us the ministry of reconciliation. So do not lose hope, but pray and trust in the Lord. Then do what he has called you to do, and you might be surprised that reconciliation can still happen. I love you. I'll be praying for you. Have a good and godly day, and if the Lord wills, I will see you tomorrow.